battle of dogmas. Right, okay. So first of all, what you're going to be voting, the reason you'll be voting against the Reformation today is because they make a number of presuppositions about the nature of riots and the nature of police brutality. And the first of which is that the incidents at Ferguson were race motivated. Now, race is a very peculiar concept that we will be going over the course of this speech, and this will be the essence of a critique, according to which you'll ultimately be voting against our opponents for every instance wherein they use the expression either race, racism, or racially, and we'll get to that very swiftly. Now, the first point is that they talk about white supremacy, and this presupposes the existence of some other. To be very clear, Slavoj Žižek, who's a Balkan philosopher and a critic of capitalism and an advocate for human rights, insists that we make a grievous error, much like, Philip K. Dick refers to as calling them the proverbial they, when we insist that basically the power structure of society is operated by some kind of bureaucracy working in conspiracy, and that they operate according to a plan which we ourselves are capable of comprehending intellectually. You see, as Camus would put it, we all have in the back of our minds a nostalgia for things being unified, for things making sense, and so it helps us to make sense of what seems to be an absurd situation by blaming the other, by blaming, be it the white man or the Jewish man, if you're part of the neo-Nazi inclination, or you might say the black man, or whoever happens to be the scapegoat. And isn't it interesting that oftentimes when we blame the scapegoat, we very rarely describe the scapegoat as being weak. We very rarely actually acknowledge that we deplore weakness in people. Rather, we try to marginalize them by elevation. That is to say, that in the same way as religious scholar Watts argues that the Christians rendered the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth to be irrelevant by elevating him and saying that only he can be the Son of God, whereas another interpretation of his teachings is that we're all sons of God. In the same way, we parrot the old Hegelian dialectic of master and slave class in such a way that will make one group of people who are actually, in many instances, also minority groups feel irrelevant. I have to say personally, from my own personal experience, as a Russian Jew of partial German descent in the United States, that I'm thankful that I don't have to go to a place like Greece to be discriminated against for being Jewish. I can be discriminated against here for being white. And according to many of the same fascistic principles which disguise themselves as anti-fascism, you see, one thing that people don't know about Hegel, the one who came up with the dialectic of master and slave, is that Hegel didn't only influence Martin Luther King and Karl Marx and all of these other fellows, he also influenced Hitler. And I don't think that we should buy into what Winston Churchill said also, or we shouldn't buy into what Winston Churchill warned us against, which is that fascism would come onto the scene under the guise of proto-fascism, or anti-fascism, sorry. And you might notice something else. You might notice that a lot of the names that I've dropped so far have happened to have been all white men. Why is that? Well, if you have noticed that, it's simply a projection of your own shortcomings, because everyone, most of the individuals I mentioned are from a diverse backgrounds, of ethnic backgrounds. The only reason why people presume to believe in the existence of white supremacy, outside of the fact that this was a Nazi plan that never came to fruition, is because white people constitute a majority. So it's natural that the majority, just probabilistically, that most of the people that I mentioned would happen, as warrants, would happen to fit the example of white. But I mean, I think that what you probably want to weigh by is actually that, I mentioned English people, I mentioned French people, I mentioned German people. These are very diverse cultures which have been in conflict with one another since time immemorial. Going on, they talk about Ferguson, and they insist that basically Ferguson is an example of white supremacy. First of all, no, I don't think that anyone actually claimed that this, who was actually on the scene, that this was an instance of oppression based upon this mind virus. And keep in mind that the mind virus is different for every individual who has it. That is to say, that I can tell you that one person in this room is a witch, and every one of you will have a different conception of what this person is. You think I'm joking, but this was a serious problem for people back in the Middle Ages. Anyone could be a witch, and if the priest says that one person is a witch, well, then everyone has a different conception of what that is, so everyone is suspicious of each other. And wouldn't you love, if you intended to create a fascistic society, to create this kind of environment? I personally would too. Thankfully, I'm not that kind of person, and unfortunately, it seems as though our affirmative friends over there are kind of going a little bit, let's say they're going so far left, they're coming out the other side on the far right. Needless to say, we don't know what actually happened at Ferguson. Not one of us will ever know what is going on in the mind of that police officer, because we weren't in direct relationship with that officer. And while I don't mean to totally sell out in favor of Simone de Beauvoir's feminist ethic of ambiguity, suggesting that we can never know whether a certain person is ethical, still, there seems to be, isn't there, the fact that we can't know if we're not in interaction with that person. If someone oppresses you directly, you know that person is being oppressive, though you will never fully know what's going on in that person's mind. You'll never know what the intentions are of any one individual police officer, even if you served on the force, even if you interacted with police officers in the past. That will always reflect your own prejudice, because that individual subject, that individual rests outside of the comprehension of the mass. And that's the final reason why you'll be voting for this critique. Because besides the impacts that I've already mentioned, those of fascism and those of reinforcing basically a misguided and skewed conception of race and being unhistorical, you'll also be voting against mass-mindedness. And of course all of these ideas are contingent to one another. You'll be voting against this culture that we've established, which forces individuals to surrender their autonomy to the mass, which is, however, is random. It's irresponsible. And we pretend that it makes sense. We pretend, oh, well, of course, you can see these racial trends, you can see these gender trends, but really, it's just random people not taking responsibility for their own actions. However, if we acknowledge that we do not know what an individual is thinking, it's possible for us, at least as individuals, to make more informed decisions than this police officer who may very well have been in the wrong. So for all these reasons, you will be voting negative.